Good evening. It's great to have you all here. See such a wonderful, receptive group to kick off our symposium, Witnessing Genocide, Representation and Responsibility, which the Humanities Center is hosting in collaboration with the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies. The symposium commemorates the 11th anniversary of a conference organized by the Oregon Humanities Center in 1996 called Ethics After the Holocaust. And that earlier conference had a profound influence on the University of Oregon. Indeed, the Ethics After the Holocaust conference helped create the momentum that led to the founding of the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies here at the University of Oregon, and it had a lasting impact on the city of Eugene and on the Willamette Valley as a whole. And there are so many people to thank that I know I'm going to leave people out, and so you're going to have to bear with me. This is going to be for a while what a classics professor calls an encomium. So it's always more fun when you make fun of people and some to listen to it than praise them, but I would like to thank a number of people. The faculty at the University of Oregon. Stephen Stern mentioned Cheney Ryan, who's not here tonight. He was absolutely key in the first the Ethics After the Holocaust conference. Dick Stein, a professor in the English department, was the chair of the Judaic Studies Committee and worked very hard to make it a reality. Esther Jacobson also was on that committee, and I believe Matt Dennis was at all, and I think at least some of them are with us tonight. Our 1996 conference focused on the Holocaust, and we decided this time to take a more sweeping look at the broader phenomenon of genocide, specifically to explore various modes of how one represents the unthinkable and the unrepresentable horrors of genocide, and to inquire into the ethical obligations of those who witness such events. And I'm very grateful to all our guests who have traveled long distances to be with us for this symposium. And as I say, there's so many people to thank. I want to start by expressing my deep gratitude to the staff of the Oregon Humanities Center, to Julia Hayden, Melissa Gustafson, Peg Gerhardt for their extraordinary efforts, Noel Alawi. This organization so far, I shouldn't jinx it, has been absolutely flawless. And also to our student volunteers. We have so many hard-working student volunteers. Thank you all very much. And my thanks go as well to the organizing committee of the conference, Jeffrey Lebret, Judith Baskin, David Lupke, Julie Newton, Sarah Bungham, and Kristen Yates of the Office of Development of the College of Arts and Sciences. And there are lots of sponsors to thank. The Wilberta Ripley Savage Endowment for International Relations and Peace, the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer Care Foundation, the George Ann and Dr. Kenneth Singer and Mrs. Roberta Singer Family Fund in Judaic Studies. I think Ken and Roberta are here this evening. Ken, are you too modest to be? There's Ken back there. I think we want to give a round to Ken. Don Shearson, Michael and Michelle Wiener, Howard Zellman. The symposium, as I've mentioned, is co-sponsored by the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies at the University of Oregon. There also have been many other contributors: the Oregon Humanities Center Public Programs Fund, the Tzedek Professorship at the University of Oregon, the College of Arts and Sciences, Comparative Literature, English, Ethnic Studies, German and Scandinavian, German Studies Committee, Department of History. I guess I should. I'm just very thankful, so I would like to do this. You say Dayenu, but I think we need to keep going here. The Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art, the School of Journalism and Communication, the Lowenberg Fund for Holocaust Education, the Department of Philosophy, Political Science, the Office of the President, Office of the Provost, Oregon Holocaust Resource Center, Pacific University, the Department of Religious Studies, which, yes, still exists and is thriving, the Department of Romance Languages, and the UO Hillel Foundation. So I'm going to introduce the introducer of tonight's distinguished speaker, who will, by the way, and we have with us a very distinguished and very lively speaker, Samantha Power, who's going to be signing books after the lecture in just a moment. I promised her that I would, well, no, I don't think I'll do that. But first, I need to let you know that our first, well, she wanted me to do my JFK imitation. I'll say, she teaches at the John F. Kennedy School for Public Affairs at Harvard University, and we're very happy to have her with us tonight. She told me I was in the wrong profession, so I can't say. So the book signing, I want to tell you about that and let you know that our first keynote speaker will be delivering at the same time the Oregon Humanities Center's inaugural Zedek Lecture, an endowed lecture made possible by the generosity of David Stern and Nancy Guiteau, and we have David and Nancy with us. If you wouldn't mind allowing us to acknowledge you. Stephen Stern has stolen my thunder, but I'll just repeat what he said, that the word Zedek in Hebrew means righteousness, and a tzaddik is someone who not only talks about, but actually does the right thing. The word can refer to someone who, at the risk of his own personal safety, did the right thing and hid and looked after Jews during the Holocaust. David and Nancy wanted the legacy of our Ethics After the Holocaust conference to live on beyond that particular event. So it's very fitting that this symposium is beginning with the inaugural Zedek Lecture. Tonight's Zedek Lecturer will be introduced by Linda Brady, the Provost of the University of Oregon. Linda joined the U of O as Senior Vice President and Provost very recently, July 1st of last year, after serving for 5 years as Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and Professor of Political Science at North Carolina State University. She's a very appropriate person tonight to be introducing our speaker because of her field of expertise. She's a well-known scholar in the field of international negotiations and arms control. She led the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology from 1993 to 2001, where she also served as a professor of international affairs. She's been a distinguished professor of national security at the U.S. Military Academy and a senior fellow in international security and arms control at the Carter Center of Emory University. From 1978 to 85, she held various positions in the U.S. Department of State and the Department of Defense, and she served as a political analyst in the State Department's Office of Disarmament and Arms Control, and was Special Assistant for Mutual and Balanced Force Reductions in the Defense Department during the Carter administration. So please join me in welcoming University of Oregon Provost Linda Brady.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm not sure that I can follow Steve's act. But I indeed am delighted to be here. I am so pleased to be able to serve as provost of this great university. It's a university that is distinguished by the quality of the educational experience that we're engaged in, by the dedication of our faculty and staff, and by the enthusiasm of our students. And I do want to thank all of you for being here this evening. It is indeed my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Samantha Power. Samantha is the Anna Lind Professor of the Practice of Global Leadership and Public Policy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Her book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, was awarded the 2003 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction, the 2003 National Book Critics Circle Award for General Nonfiction, and the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Prize for the best book in U.S. foreign policy. Power's New Yorker article on the horrors in Darfur, Sudan, won the 2005 National Magazine Award for Best Reporting. Power was the founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. From 1993 to 1996, she covered the wars in the former Yugoslavia as a reporter for the U.S. News and World Report, the Boston Globe, and The Economist. Power is the editor, with Graham Allison, of Realizing Human Rights, Moving from Inspiration to Impact. She's a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Law School. She moved to the United States from Ireland at the age of 9. And we are so delighted to welcome Samantha Power tonight to the University of Oregon.
You should hear his Borat imitation. It's great to be here. There's an amazing energy in the room and in the hood. It's really a privilege when you can just tell the difference when you come and try to engage with people, and you can just feel when a community has invested in a topic and in a set of ideals, and it's palpable here this evening, and I'm sure it'll remain so the next couple days and on into the months ahead. But an awful lot of people put their work and their energy into this evening. And Steve, I don't know, you gave that exhaustive list, but I caution you in the future of giving such exhaustive lists, because when you give an exhaustive list, whoever you left out is so pissed off right now. But I'll give a much shorter list and thank Steve and Julia. Julia apparently is the engine that makes everything happen on this entire campus. And I just, unfortunately, because nothing like this has ever happened to me before, I have to tell a brief story. So I came in and had to get up really early this morning from Boston, poor me. And then I flew and I arrived and I wanted to go running, but I didn't have very much time. And she came up to my room, she gave me a map, and she showed me how I get to the river. And so I watched a couple innings of the Red Sox-Yankee game, and then, put my running shoes on and went out to run. And I had my little map, and I was going to be completely fine because she had shown me all the trails on the map. But that wasn't good enough for Julia. So when I got to the part that would have been hard, although I am an adult, she was standing there at the part which might not have been obvious. And so I said, okay, what are you doing here? I said, have you been waiting here since you dropped me off at the hotel? And she said, just a few minutes. And I said, but I watched the game. Had I known, I would have. Anyway, so then instead of pointing me down this trail and just saying, make a right and then a left, and then she, wearing black dress shoes that she's wearing now as we speak, ran with me. I'm not making this up. So I've been traveling now for 4 years and so forth. I've never been treated with this kind of care, and so thank you. All right, and then finally, let me thank David and Nancy and for their generosity, and just the whole conceit behind this lectureship seems to me very grand and very much a testament to the people who drummed this up, and I'm hugely honored to be the inaugural lecturer. It's a great thrill. So what I'm here to talk about, unfortunately, is can genocide be stopped in an age of terror? And so what I thought I would do is look at structurally the difficulty in stopping genocide in any old age, in the modern age, how many impediments there are, imaginative, institutional, political, moral, perhaps, that get in the way and that just make it really, really tough for all of the grand consensus around the idea of never again, when it comes to operationalizing that commitment, it's just really hard. And I'd like to just talk at the beginning about why that is. But then turn to looking at the so-called Age of Terror, at least as we've come to conceive it in this country, and look at what that has done to our commitments and to the learning that we actually did manage to do over the course of 60 years. Not great learning, not hugely impressive results, but nonetheless you can actually see steadily in U.S. society and even within the government a fair amount of learning. And so I want to look at the degree to which this so-called global war on terror has affected that learning and conditioned it and affected potential performance in terms of preventing, suppressing, or punishing this horrible crime. And then I'll close with just some ideas about how we move forward in light of the fact that this, conception of an age of terror isn't going anywhere. You're not seeing any of the major contenders in the 2008 election really challenging the frame. That may change over the course of the next year or so, but in all likelihood, most policy decisions are going to be processed through the prism of their relationship to our national security, and specifically, through the prism of their relationship to terrorism and to stopping it and to preventing further attacks against Americans. So first, let me just talk more generally about the structural difficulty that institutions have kind of turning their rusty and very cumbersome machinery in a timely fashion so as to matter for potential victims of genocide. Why is it so hard when you have a crime atop the hierarchy of the horribles, when there is this moral imperative, when we have such cultural awareness, that took quite a while to achieve in this country around the Holocaust and around the memory of that and the so-called lessons of that? Why do we have a Cambodia, Saddam's gassing of the Kurds in Iraq, Rwanda, Bosnia, Indonesia and East Timor, Darfur today? What is it that impedes our responsiveness? Well, the main answer is that, of course, the entire interstate system or international system is predicated, and its building blocks are states. And states, governments, are very, very explicit, no matter how righteously they conceive themselves, they're very explicit about existing to pursue the national interest as they conceive it at home. And, I was talking to Steve earlier about this. This is not a Kissingerian conceit. This is the nature of what government is. The people who vote in this country tend to cast their votes not on the basis of foreign policy priorities or judgments, but rather on issues related to education, healthcare, tax policies, things that affect you. To the degree that you are prone to vote on foreign policy grounds, it's because your government has led you astray, and where American interests are being harmed, as they are currently in Iraq, and you start to see the natural democratic corrective pushing back in the last election and perhaps in the next one, certainly in public opinion polls and so forth with relation to the president. But that's very, very different than imagining distant atrocity, distant horrors actually permeating our political culture to such an extent that a politician or set of policymakers would see it as being in their interest to be responsive in the face of genocide. And so, the basic fact of the matter is, given that national interest is defined and has been, not just since Kissinger, but really for several centuries, around the pursuit of economic and national security interests, it's not hugely surprising that genocide has not, measured up, has not earned itself a seat at the table, as it were, with these other primary national concerns. It doesn't, when it occurs, believe it or not, intrinsically rise within the bureaucracy in this country, nor does it intrinsically rise in countries that you might suspect would be more human rights friendly or whose political cultures are more rooted in self-abnegation or in humanitarianism. even in those countries, it just doesn't earn the attention of the most senior policymakers unless you can find a nexus, again, with those traditional interests that politicians know that they live or die by. And so that's the very bad news. There's a bureaucratic marginalization of atrocities that, for us, in retrospect, we look back, or even today with Darfur, you think, wow, these are the crimes that history books will be made of, and yet on their own, unless you can sort of smuggle them in within the Trojan horse of some other national interest, they tend not to get senior policymakers' attention. The second consequence of this national interest imperative is that if you think of American foreign policy, if you think of any government's foreign policy as I do, as a toolbox, and in the toolbox you have diplomatic, economic, military, you have unilateral, regional, multilateral, all kinds of responses you could muster to any given threat, to Iranian enrichment, to North Korean nuclear test, to the Arab-Israeli peace process, or to a case of genocide. There are a whole range of tools in the toolbox that one could imagine bringing to bear. Now, in the case of genocide, those tools vary, but they could include top-down denunciation by the president, just simply saying what you're doing is wrong, it's genocide, adding that perhaps we're going to punish you, that there is an international system now in place to prosecute crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, expelling diplomats from countries that are committing genocide who happen to be present in the U.S., closing down an embassy or trying to get an ambassador thrown off the Security Council if they happen to be represented. All kinds of diplomatic measures to show that something matters to you as a state, as a government. Economic sanctions, you have the generalized ones that tend to probably harm more people than they help. But in the case of genocide, usually it's quite a small group of perpetrators, who, at least if it's a state-based genocide, who operate at the helm and are very, very interested in bringing home the spoils of genocide, the money, the bank accounts that they have been stashing funds away in, the proceeds from arms smuggling and so forth. I mean, there's a range of financial incentives that motivate the bad guys in cases like this. And again, it's usually not an infinite list. It's usually an identifiable list. If you were to deploy the intelligence assets and find those names, name those names, you could do asset freezes. You could, try to impede capital flows. You could impose just travel bans so they're stuck in the country in question. And often, despite this genocidal and highly nationalistic or xenophobic attitude or mentality, they're actually really looking forward to going to the south of France or to, traveling beyond the domains that they're wreaking such havoc. And then you make your way and you think about no-fly zones that potentially would neutralize, airplanes that are being used to bomb civilian centers, as is going on currently in Sudan, as went on in the Balkans in the 90s. Multilateral peacekeeping or peace enforcement scenarios by which you rally troops from other countries, perhaps from the region or more globally, to either try to stop the killing or to create safe areas that are actually safe in border areas so refugees can flee until the overall atrocity campaign can be halted. And then outright, military intervention or airstrikes of the kind that occurred belatedly in Bosnia in 1995. There's a range of tools in the toolbox. And what's astounding about looking at a century of U.S., which is what I looked at, but really of Western democratic responses to genocide, is the degree to which that toolbox remained sealed shut. So you're not seeing, the use of the softer sanctions, the diplomatic, the economic, and so forth, and then, countries perhaps understandably pulling up short, as war is a very a tool that is so dangerous and should be used so sparingly. But it's not as if countries come to the brink and then pull up short when it comes to risking national blood and so forth. The toolbox is shut. It's as if, because our post-Holocaust commitment around never again is what it is, especially in the U.S., and because the idea of genocide captivates people, the idea of stopping it captivates people, there seems to be a concern on the part of policymakers that if they even dip their toe in, if they even open up that toolbox, then they're on the hook to go the whole way. So you see, as you know, in the 90s, and the utter opposition on the part of politicians and policymakers to even use the word genocide for fear that that would oblige stronger action. A fear in the case of Rwanda, a perfect example is radio jamming, which the US alone on the earth had the tool to do. It would have cost $8,500 an hour, but it would have basically just impeded the broadcasting of the names and addresses of potential victims of that genocide and the hate, the exterminatory propaganda. $8,500 is a lot, but it's not a lot compared to the $400 billion Pentagon budget. And but the fear was if the US were to do radio jamming and get in the way of what the genocidaires were doing, let's just say they then moved the transmitter or found another way to broadcast, then what? Then the US is on the hook to do the next thing, and then so the lesson of what became known in the 90s as the Vietmalia syndrome, a combination of Vietnam and Somalia, and that idea that there's no such thing as a small engagement, that if you're the United States and you're the sole superpower, as we were in those years, the people are going to look to you to go all the way. And there is something kind of pathetically incommensurate between denouncing genocide on the one hand and then proposing radio jamming on the other, if you are the most powerful country in the history of mankind. And I think that tension and that inconsistency led policymakers, again, across, this is not a partisan point, this is, across party and geography and time, but to want it, just the thing to go away and to not put the U.S. seal or brand upon it. Now, you may say, well, okay, the U.S., maybe that's obvious given, the nature of foreign policy in this country, but what about countries, European countries that have much more overt, thicker, arguably, public commitments to humanitarianism? Where are they? Well, it turns out they're pretty good in certain ways in that, as you know, they give a much larger percentage of their GDP to development aid and to foreign assistance than we do in the United States. Smaller whole number, but a greater percentage. And they invest in ways that we have not yet conditioned ourselves to invest in international institutions. Not only the UN and peacekeeping and international treaties and so forth, but also the new International Criminal Court. So they make these kind of longer-term investments financially and in the case of the ICC, punitively. But that actually turns out doesn't buy you very much when people are being murdered in a 100-day period, as we're in Rwanda. Or it doesn't buy you much today in Darfur, where development assistance will be great in terms of rebuilding the place. But who is actually going to get in there and impede the Janjaweed and the Sudanese government actually, murdering what is now 300,000, 400,000 people? So there's a kind of constituency void on the international stage where no country naturally gravitates, has the sort of set of ingredients internally in terms of self-identity, in terms of tools in the toolbox, to actually take ownership of bringing Never Again, to life. Now, so that's point one, is that this national interest frame is very, very detrimental. It's just hard for genocide to penetrate it, no matter how bad the carnage. The second point that's part of this tradition, even before the so-called Age of Terror, is that this kind of top-down neglect of an issue of such monumental magnitude is abetted by society-wide silence or reticence. And this was one of the things that I found sort of really interesting about spending 6 or 7 years looking at American responses to genocide and then looking also at European responses in a less detailed way. But what you see is the one way that mass atrocity in Rwanda or in Bosnia or in Iraq back in the day or in Iraq even today, the one way it could penetrate that hierarchy is if it came to trigger and implicate domestic political interests of policymakers or of politicians. So, if it's not going to be itself a vital national interest, but if you have a politician in place who feels that he or she eventually is vulnerable, that there's going to be actually a price to be paid for being a bystander to genocide, even a reputational cost, then that then has the chance to secure in a bottom-up way high-level leadership. It takes sort of, you don't actually have to work through the bureaucracy and insinuate and make your way up to the highest levels. It'll come almost laterally, because the pressure from the outside, whether by virtue of the Congress using its purse strings, or just banging down the door of the executive branch, or just the people, just constituents putting so much pressure that then the president and his political advisors, the Karl Roves of the world, the Bob Shrums of the world, they feel that it's in the president's domestic political interest to take notice. That's the back door. That's the way these issues can resonate. And the only intervention you saw over the course of the 20th century that was motivated really by a regard for atrocity, mass atrocity, was that which occurred in Bosnia in 1995. And it occurred because the domestic political price being paid by Bill Clinton for doing nothing had become so great that in that cost-benefit analysis that normally cuts in favor of doing nothing about genocide, suddenly it cut in the opposite direction. He's thinking, God, I'm paying such a price at home. I'm looking like I'm not a leader. The entire Congress is mutinied against me. My allies won't talk to me. There were all these costs to being a bystander. And over the course of a 3.5-year conflict, the perceived cost of getting involved had shrunk. So that balance then cut in favor of doing something. Now, the political pressure at home came from a wonderfully unlikely group of bedfellows. It was George Soros, on the left, teaming up with Jeane Kirkpatrick on the right. In the New York Times op-ed pages, it was Anthony Lewis, again, I guess of the left, and William Safire of the right. It was Jewish groups who said, "There but for the grace of God go I," given that there were emaciated men behind barbed wire again in Europe 50 years after the Holocaust. I mean, it's an amazing bottom-up, sort of more grass tops than grass roots, but it had, it had a profound effect on President Clinton. But that domestic silence, what I've just described is the exception that proves the rule. The better testament to the 20th century, I think, came in late April 1994, 2.5 weeks into the Rwandan genocide. The Colorado congressperson, Patricia Schroeder, who was on the African Affairs Subcommittee on the House side, was asked why the Congress had not held a single hearing about the bloodshed in Rwanda. At that point, 200,000 people had already died, but not yet the 800,000 that would die in that 100 days. But there were 200,000 in. It was in the paper every day, and so some, reporters usually didn't even ask about it, but in this instance asked, "What's up with that? Why no hearings? Why no nothing? How is this not even the subject of discussion in Washington?" And she said what I think is the most priceless and truly deeply honest thing that anybody said for that entire 100 days. Is she said, "I know." She said, "It's just we're not really hearing from anybody." She said, we're getting all kinds of calls, both in Colorado and in Washington, from groups that are concerned about the fate of the endangered gorillas, but nobody's calling about the people, And that is such a truth, because we all know, there are groups that do mobilize quickly, whether around monuments. I mean, I'm sure those of you who are, in endangered species movements feel like you don't have near enough clout. People who look out for, the Buddhas in Afghanistan and mobilize, feel like, well, you didn't, we weren't able to stop the Taliban there. But compared, especially back in the mid-90s, compared to the human rights movement, you're like a Madison Avenue, network. And the same is true of the environmental movement, which I think, human rights advocates look at very enviously at the sophistication of the effort and so forth. I know people in the environmental movement, of course, feel completely outmatched, by big business and by the imagination and so forth. But I think that testament, no one calling about the people, lots of people calling about the guerrillas because of Diana Fossey and that whole movement and so forth. Victims of genocide just rarely, when it matters for them, have natural and mobilized advocates in political processes. And we know how the system works, so until it is the system, and we don't love the system, but the system is what it is. We know when results are achieved, they're achieved because noise is made, political pressure is exerted, and so forth. So that's the sort of bad news structurally. But the good news, again, prior to the age of terror, such as it is, is that there was actually real progress made, especially in the post-Cold War period, on genocide prevention, suppression, and punishment. So I'd like to just touch upon that progress, because it's ultimately what we'll have to come back to if we're not going to have more conferences like this 100 years from now that look at the 21st century's genocides and so forth. So my fantasy when I wrote this book, A Problem from Hell, was the first fantasy was to find a publisher, and the second was was for some readers outside my very large Irish family to find their way to the book. But apart from those fantasies, to the degree that I could dream big, I guess because there are these 2 points to the book. One is that in a top-down way, it hasn't tended to rank, and there hasn't been top-down leadership, so we shouldn't be surprised that genocide keeps happening and the U.S. doesn't play a role. And then there was a second point about the kind of bottom-up and how that could really make a difference and so forth. But my fantasy was very rooted in the first point. I just thought, maybe best case scenario, somehow, this book, or these findings make their way into some high-level government meeting, and somebody says, shocked, we meant to do more, and now we can do more. And a presidential decision directive that, entails talking with our allies and getting resources mobilized preventively, proactively, so that you have things on call, which in turn can potentially deter, investing in punishment and some of these tribunals, but it would be top-down. And that really hasn't happened. And what's happened is sort of beyond my wildest dreams is the second approach, which is more the bottom-up, and it's grassroots and grass tops. And this I never really even thought could happen, because it just seems so cumbersome and so hard to get people out of their chairs on the basis of distant suffering. I mean, there could be potentially a passive constituency to be led, but I never imagined that there'd be an active constituency that would lead and sort of force policymakers into taking heed of issues that they'd prefer to ignore. And so part of what I struggle with daily these days is trying to understand where this movement in the United States has come from. And for those of you, I know some of you here are engaged in it in terms of the Darfur advocacy and so forth, but just a few examples of what amounts to a potentially long-term anti-genocide constituency akin to those groups that called Patricia Schroeder about the Endangered Girls. I mean, basically it's an endangered peoples movement. It's fragile, it's youth-driven, it's not hugely sophisticated yet, but it's paying real dividends. And so let me just describe a few of those dividends. I mean, in the case of Darfur, there's absolutely nothing in the U.S. national interest right now, in the Bush administration's interest, that cuts in favor of paying a lot of attention to what's going on in Darfur. We got Iraq, we got Iran enrichment, North Korea, Afghanistan, the Arab-Israeli situation. Right now, we have 2 live wars underway, one in Afghanistan, one in Iraq. The Bush administration, its foreign policy neurons, whatever whatever number there are there, they're somewhere, they're very, very consumed by hardcore national security interests. So how is it that George Bush is spending any time talking about Darfur? Well, the answer is this movement, which is a hodgepodge of student chapters across the country, which is the largest foreign policy-related student movement since the anti-apartheid movement, Jewish groups who, in the wake of Colin Powell's genocide declaration in September 2004, just activated in profound ways, evangelicals who got involved in Sudan when it was Christians who were dying in the south, and then as soon as it was Muslims dying in Darfur, not as quite as soon as, but within a year of the start of that killing, actually made the turn and used their incredible access to the president and his advisors to actually put Darfur firmly on the map. Now, I think it's really important for advocates not to go into self-congratulatory, joy over the size of this movement. That a year ago a year ago tomorrow, there was a rally on the Mall in Washington, and it was a sight the likes of which I never thought I would see. It was as far as the eye could see, like the March on Washington. It was 85,000 people who had come to protest the U.S. indifference on Darfur. 85,000 people. I mean, what's up with that? Where did that come from? At a time of Iraq, and you can't get 85,000 people on an Iraq related protests. You certainly couldn't get 85 people, I don't even think, to close Guantanamo. But you had this massive, sprawling crowd, and it was really, again, people of all very, very different political persuasions and backgrounds and so forth. But you know, if 1% had ever met a person from Darfur, I'd be surprised. So something is afoot. Now, I have a few theories on where this movement is coming from, but I think part of it is just a lot of these young people are the Hotel Rwanda generation. They saw the movie, what you know, for the older generation, Shoah might have constituted. There's this, you know, real cultural attention to Rwanda in Hollywood and in schools and so forth. I mean, syllabi actually teaching modern genocide right alongside the Holocaust, incredibly important. Many of the people in the movement are high school students, or they go on then and launch college chapters when they get to university. To some degree, Clinton, who apologized for his sort of disengagement on Rwanda, issued an apology in 1998. I think that has created a space in our society such that no one can really say, oh, we did well during Rwanda, or there was nothing we can do. When the president who did nothing is saying, I should have done this, I should have done this, it just has created something that you don't normally see in the wake of a mistake, and that is relative consensus. I mean, there's just hardly any issues do you have that kind of consensus over, and it made it impossible for people to say, oh, no, Clinton's wrong. He really should have done exactly what he did, you know, when he's going around saying it's the biggest mistake of his presidency. But I think the third thing that's at work in this movement is, in fact, displaced anxiety about American foreign policy more generally, that's kind of getting channeled around something that feels quite clear-cut relative to what to do about Iraq. I mean, certainly there are people who, you know, are in favor of getting out of Iraq tomorrow. There are people who support staying and feel like we have a responsibility. But a lot of people are really confused, and they feel like the very same thing that might make them interested in a genocide conference makes them utterly confused about what to do in a place where the violence is becoming increasingly sectarian and almost genocidal, and in terms of civilians being targeted, not for anything they have done as individuals, but simply because of some sectarian identity. So I think there's a lot of confusion about Iraq. Darfur just seems much tidier, as if it's more obvious, you know, what you can do, and as if the bad guys and the good guys and the potential for a constructive role is there. So there is this movement, and it has produced real dividends, but not at all sufficient dividends. The crimes in Darfur are now being tried at the International Criminal Court, basically because this movement made it impossible for Bush to veto the referral of those crimes in the Security Council to the ICC. Bush administration hates the ICC, as you know, but they didn't feel like they could veto because of all of this noise from all of these strange bedfellows. So the cases are now before the ICC, and again, this is a development that there is punishment, at least potentially, on the horizon for the worst perpetrators. And even if those perpetrators don't come into custody, their ability to leave and to travel and so forth is going to be gravely limited, because this court, almost because it's despised by the Bush administration, has actual standing and legitimacy. I hate to say that, but that is the perverse, given our isolation in the world, our hostility to the ICC is probably the best thing that could have happened to the ICC over the course of the last 6 years. And there's strong evidence of that. That's not even a contested point. So in Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, you might have great skepticism about a court based in the Netherlands trying African crimes, but again, that those vitriolic denunciations out of the Bush administration in the early years toward the court give it a standing, and then the Bush administration couldn't veto because of this pressure it was feeling. Second, even though it's important to focus on the people who've died in Darfur, 2 million people are being kept alive in camps, and 70% of the humanitarian aid is being paid for by this administration. Again, because every time the money comes up for a vote in the Congress, the phones just ring off the hook. And I worked last year in Senator Obama's office. I mean, you got more calls about Darfur than you got about Iraq. So something is afoot. Importantly, and it'll come to now my third and sort of final section, which is the Age of Terror, but the movement is learning to bypass the U.S. government and actually find levers into countries that have more leverage right now internationally than the United States has, specifically China. So I'm not sure where University of Oregon is on this, but there's been a like brush fire a divestment movement that has spread across the country. Harvard University was one of the first universities to divest. The fact that the word genocide was used to describe Darfur proved really helpful for university corporations and legal counsels and so forth, because they could say, okay, we don't want to do human rights scrutiny of our entire portfolio, but occasionally there are crimes that are just so awful. And in the entire history of the US State Department, they've never done a genocide finding before. So the fact that they've done one for Sudan means, we can safely go over our portfolio and say, is any company doing business in Sudan? If so, let's divest. And that's what's happened. You now have, I don't know what it is up to now, 6 universities or something that have divested. You also have the entire California State Pension Fund, 7 other state pension funds. It's again, where this is coming from is very interesting. So divestment is one way. Those companies doing business are Chinese companies for the most part. And then you have the new movement, which is to get China to use its leverage over Sudan, because they're very, very close, much closer than the US and Sudan because of the congressional interference with the US doing business in Sudan, it dates back to the prior civil war in Sudan. But China has all the leverage. And so now there's an effort, the student movement is trying to create a campaign around what's called the Genocide Olympics. And the Genocide Olympics is basically to say, hey, China, this is your coming out. This is you asserting yourself. Really, it's your unveiling to the world as the 21st century power that you are, political as well as economic. Do you really want it to be tainted? You've built all those nice new roads. You have all those nice new hotels. Do you really want it to be known as the Genocide Olympics? Well, that's what's going to happen if you're seen to be complicit in these atrocities. So now this is a US-based movement, and it's not a global movement yet, but it's actually it seems to be getting notice. The other advances prior to this bubbling up, which is really just the last 5 or 6 years, of course, do come with regard to punishment. The fact that you had 50 years passed between Nuremberg and the creation of 2 war crimes tribunals, one for Yugoslavia, one for Rwanda, and then that those tribunals gave way to one for Sierra Leone, and then the ICC, which is a court that's meant to have universal jurisdiction and ensure that we don't have to keep inventing the wheel every time a mass atrocity occurs. There's actually a court in place that conceivably, if it really starts to function, can deter. The fact that you actually saw belatedly humanitarian intervention, such as however one refers to it, in Kosovo, in Sierra Leone, in East Timor, all in 1999, 2000. But there was a sense among politicians that, in this cost-benefit thing, these atrocities aren't going anywhere, and we're going to be hearing it from our constituents. So more pain now, less pain later. The refugee flows are expensive. The potential for regional conflict where genocide spills over into other places. All of that created a deterrent where politicians actually started doing things that they hadn't done for the prior 90 years of the century. So what about the age of terror? What does that mean now to those patterns and the sort of, the tendencies, the vectors that were going in one direction or another before 9/11? Well, the first, I think, obvious but very, very important point is that U.S. influence is hugely eroded as a result of as a result of the decision to go to war in Iraq, the conduct of the war in Iraq, our detention policies, extraordinary rendition, torture, but not just torture, the lack of accountability in the face of torture beyond a staff sergeant level. This sort of impugning of America's standing internationally has in fact very tangibly undermined U.S. influence. And I think it's really important to think about, people tend to talk still about the U.S. as the sole superpower and so forth, but power is best measured by influence. And hard power, military and economic power, are one component of influence. And we still, even being overstretched in Iraq and being in deficit, are a very potent, obviously, player on the world stage, militarily and economically. But the other components of influence are not just hard power, but other people's perception that we are using our power properly. And perhaps, and that's legitimacy, you might say, crucially, but often not talked about, other people's perception that we're using our power competently. And here you cannot, I think, overstate the twin impact of Iraq on the one hand and Katrina on the other. The two together, and that sense, that window into the country that had once put the man on the moon, now to have these emblems of our capacity to do what we set our minds to, almost regardless of the morality of our objectives. So that influence is eroded, and you can see it in the Iranian nuclear talks. You can see it on, this is a very small issue right now, but it's fascinating that Kosovo independence is up for discussion at the UN Security Council. The huge expectation among everyone was that at the Security Council you have 15 countries. It was pretty much understood that the vote in the council would be 14-1, with Russia taking the side of the Serbs and the U.S. basically, the U.S. position on independence, attracting everybody else. It now seems as if the U.S. is not going to be able to get 3 or 4 votes in the Security Council on behalf of this thing that just seemed a fait accompli, not so long ago, a delicate fait accompli, but a fait accompli nonetheless. There are 100 examples that one could give about evidence of this lack of influence, where we know what we want and we just can't get what we want, and others are not coming to our sides to give us backup. Second point in the age of terror is that given that loss of influence, when the U.S., which is overstretched, summons international attention to something like Darfur or to another case of genocide, it needs others to step up. And there seems to be no appetite, and there was never a great appetite, as I indicated before, but Iraq has supplied an alibi for countries that otherwise have their own reasons for not wanting to get involved in these kinds of messy situations, messy and morally devastating situations like genocide. So European publics that were always much more reticent and much less prone to banging on their government's doors about genocide, whether in Iraq, in Cambodia, in Bosnia, Rwanda, you name it. Now, Iraq and George Bush, they provide these big fat targets that allow a shirking of national responsibility. It's just so easy to pick on George Bush. It's so easy to point to the war in Iraq as what happens when you get involved in other people's societies, that whatever appetite started to exist for humanitarian intervention has, I think, been obliterated. Third, the rise of China that has gone on in this age of terror, as the U.S. has, in a sense, pulled itself out of commission or busied itself with these crises. Again, the Iraq one of very much of our own making. The already ascendant, the already sort of precipitous ascendance of China just got steeper. It just expedited that claiming of diplomatic and political clout on the international stage. The economic vector is just going the way it's going, but we are now, of course, a debtor to China, so our economic vulnerability has increased as their seeming sense of economic invincibility has also increased. So the rise of China, when it comes to genocide prevention, human rights, it's a huge factor in the age of terror. It's a huge consideration now, that where there's no one-stop shopping now. If you could get the United States on board, or supporting somebody else doing something or doing something itself in the UN Security Council in the 90s, that would be just enough. It was necessary and it was sufficient. Now, even if the United States ends up morally rehabilitated at some point and with resources to spare, there's always China just saying, no, sovereignty. We're not interested. Whatever goes on in the internal affairs is not our business. So the rise of China cannot be understated or overstated. And then finally, there's a real temptation, I think, in this country to throw baby out with bathwater in terms of U.S. ideals and to say, well, wait a minute, if democracy means, when we do democracy promotion, if that means we do regime change, or if that means we do elections but we only support elections where we get outcomes we like, then I don't want to do democracy promotion, or we, the United States, our own cultural loss of faith in our ability to be a player in a moral domain means that there's a real discrediting of the enterprise of even looking in other people's societies, and I mean really understandably. But it's something that one really has to deal with. So let me just close with 5 sort of lessons for how we deal with this mess right now. The first speaks to the point I just made about throwing our ideals out with a war and a set of practices that weren't about ideals. So the first point is to say, contrary to popular impressions right now, the war in Iraq was not the natural culmination of people like you or me who cared about humanitarian issues in other societies, and then, okay, if you care about human beings in other societies, this is what it gets you. It gets you the war in Iraq. No. In fact, so it's not as if we learned from Rwanda, therefore we did Iraq. It's absolutely the opposite. Rwanda and Iraq are the flip sides of the same coin. They're evidence of the systematic indifference to human consequences in the conduct of American foreign policy. And that indifference gives you non-intervention or non-radio jamming or non-denunciation or support for UN peacekeepers back in 1994, and it gives you this, unbelievably ideologically driven intervention where there was absolutely no plan, no proper plan to deal with the fate of the Iraqi people the morning after the invasion. I mean, how low the Iraqis ranked on the list of why we went to war by virtue of the fact that we parked our tanks in front of the oil ministry and not in front of the hospitals. You can see it in the conduct of the war and in the absence of a post-war plan. So it's really important to not allow the ideals that still are the ones that are necessary to actually permeate American foreign policy, but to accept administration rationales for the so-called war on terror. It's important to preserve those principles and understand that they are the antidote to a war on terror run in a foolhardy and often amoral way or immoral way. Second, it's really important that we recognize about our own country, having said all that we cannot do morality a la carte. You can't, even with all this incredible movement, bottom-up movement on Darfur, you can't get from President Bush a denunciation of the horrors in Darfur on a Monday and expect that denunciation to be effective in a globalized world when on the Tuesday, the vice president refers to waterboarding as a no-brainer. You can't, it doesn't work in a globalized world, not just because of the normal yammering about hypocrisy, but it just means that people think when he denounces genocide in Darfur that there's something else going on, that it's not about Darfur, it's about criticizing an Islamic government, or it's about oil, or it can't be about the people in Darfur, because they're not looking inside the black box of American decision-making and seeing this movement or anything. All they're seeing are these denunciations. They don't go together. How can being for waterboarding and against genocide? This is just in the court of public opinion. Third point, and then just two more after, is that the problems are too big. These transnational threats, and genocide often starts as an internal problem and spreads, but they're too big and they are far too complex. Even if we could reorient our society to integrate regard for human consequences, they're too big for us to handle alone. And it is imperative in the 21st century that we, totally reconceive our relationship with international institutions, which are not tailored right now to meet threats like this. They're not up to the challenge. But they're going to stay not up to the challenge so long as we turn our backs on them and do as we have done, which is to basically discredit them or show up in them, snap our fingers, want what we want when we want it, but not investing in the larger enterprise of a systemic commitment to human development and human security. Fourth, we have to continue thinking about other countries because it is a much more multipolar world. All the leadership, American leadership on genocide in the world isn't going to do the trick. You're always going to need other countries to deploy police, peacekeepers, and so forth. And right now, the appetite in middle powers and Western democracies is almost zero to actually patrol the commons, to be true resourced global citizens. There's, again, lots of commitment for development aid, but very little desire to actually do peace enforcement or peacekeeping, and that has to change. And we know from our own experience, what I've described tonight about national interests, that someone's got to find a way through the back door in these other countries, in Canada, in Britain, in Japan, in Jordan, because we know from a top-down perspective that none of those countries are going to be just as reluctant as us to have regard for stopping genocide. So how are you going to change the political incentives? How are people in those countries going to change the political incentives? How can this movement that exists here and is brewing become globalized? That's what has to happen. And then fifth, we just have to continue making noise here. We haven't maxed out on what we can extract in service of genocide prevention, even from an administration that is tainted. There's still a great deal that a country that has this much money and still considerable diplomatic clout in many quarters, including China, there's still a whole lot more than it can do. And basically, just to close by paraphrasing Don Rumsfeld, it's just essential that I don't always do that, paraphrasing, that's not, but this is worth paraphrasing. It's essential that we work with the democracy we have and not the democracy that we wish we had. So, thank you. Thanks.
Okay. She's quick. Wonderful talk. I'm sure we have some questions. We're going to ask you, if you have a question, to please come up to the microphone and ask your question. If you could, in 30 seconds or less. And the speaker has a little more time than that to answer the question.
Please.
Hi. I'm interested in anthropomorphizing and why we don't, as humans, really rush into the care of other humans. And one of the things I read in your book that was intriguing, and I was wondering if you would comment on, was how the war trials, or the criminal trials of Milosevic and his gang, weren't broadcast in Bosnia, and how the Rwandan trials were not broadcast in Rwanda. Is that a responsibility? Is that a avoiding responsibility? If you could.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So there's this. There are these amazing institutions. I mean, amazing not because they've maxed out on performance and not that they can't improve, but amazing in that it's amazing they exist after 60 years. That heads of state can find themselves vulnerable to prosecution for crimes they commit technically within their own borders, and that's what. And they're very expensive. $150 million. A year for the Yugoslav Tribunal, another 150 for the Rwanda Tribunal. And initially, the people in these societies, the victims, were delighted because, they thought, wow, at a minimum, we've had to go through all of this. We've lived this genocide of 800,000 people, or in Bosnia, 200,000 people died. And our perpetrators taunted us and said, no one will ever know. No one will ever, I'll be fine. You're the one who's going to suffer. And then suddenly you had these institutions. Now, they came into being because of there was political mobilization during the war in Bosnia for 3 years prior to reaching tipping point, such that Clinton had to act. There was about 3 years of sort of low boil, simmer political mobilization, a lot of press coverage, and Clinton the cost-benefit analysis didn't cut in favor of doing the real deed, not actually bombing or getting involved and actually closing the concentration camps or protecting the safe areas. But he wanted to get the issue off the front pages, he and the first President Bush, and so what they did is that was how the tribunal came into being. It was a way of actually getting the political noise, sort of dampening it. And that original sin, was never really, in some ways, overcome by these two, again, important institutions, insofar as they were put in place. It was about us. It was about. And this is how it has to happen, as I've said, it was about catering to domestic constituencies and kind of, just shut. That's what the decision to create the Yugoslav Tribunal was. And then Rwanda happened the year after the first Yugoslav court was set up, and so then it was like, oh my God, now we're going to look racist if we have a court for 200,000 deaths of white people and we don't have any form of prosecuting. So then the Rwanda court came up, and both these came through the UN Security Council, but we never got away from the fact that they were really rooted not in some global kind of roll up your sleeves, hey, how do we figure out how to deal with global justice, but rather, but especially, let me say, a desire to kind of make the issue go away and do something, and also to reduce pressure to do the real and the hard thing. And so to your question then, here these courts are doing justice. The Yugoslav Tribunal is in The Hague, the Rwanda Tribunal is in Tanzania, which sounds wonderfully close to Rwanda, at least it's in Africa. It's right next door, but it might as well be on the moon, because there are, as you say, there are no television proceedings that go back to Rwanda. Even if there were, Rwandans don't get their news over television. An NGO came along, a non-governmental group came along and began to pull together radio sort of documentaries, because that's how most people in Rwanda get their news. But courts, staffed by Western governments, rich governments, developed governments, are staffed by lawyers lawyers are used to operating in national systems where they don't have to create a political constituency for justice. That exists. It's all rote, in our society. I mean, even if it's, in the breach in some societies. So they went about their business of lawyering, building cases, interviewing witnesses, and so forth. And it was only, 3 or 4 years, maybe even 5 years into the existence of these $150 million courts that they started to just hear it from victims groups who were disgusted because they said, if you're going to do justice in our name, can it kindly be oriented toward those of us who want to see these perpetrators behind bars? And yet the system, it never really recovered. It remained to this, and remains to this day, staffed by lawyers, by judges, by people who don't have, again, back to Madison Avenue, don't have that instinct about packaging, who aren't thinking in terms of victims. They're thinking about doing justice in the case in hand. Now, I answered it at length because I think it's an interesting and sort of a reflective story. The good news is that the International Criminal Court, which came into existence in 2001, actually has learned from this lesson. And so Luis Moreno Ocampo, the prosecutor, and the registrar's office have a whole victims' rights unit and a whole kind of media entrepreneurial unit where it's journalists and former TV producers and so forth who are there. If they'd ever have a case, I think you really would see a much more conscientious and probably quite costly effort to make sure that the people in whose name justice is being done are actually, get to bear witness to it. Because that's how you break cycles of violence. If justice is done in a vacuum, collective guilt persists, and if there were no Nuremberg, I mean, even with Nuremberg, you see how hard it was for Germans to escape the stigma. But imagine if there are no trials, then everybody becomes characterized in a certain way. And so these trials are really important in terms of, making it possible for societies to move on, I believe, anyway. Yes, sir.
First of all, it's not Boston, but we have a marathon tomorrow, so if you want to run some more.
I think Julia might be a good candidate for that, but...
I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about Iran, about what it means for the United States, what it means for Israel, what it means for the relationship between the two, and whether or not you have concerns in terms of Iran and its move towards nuclear power, and what the United States should do, given some of the problems that we've had with our responses in other places.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a great answer or no one has a satisfying answer on Iran these days. I mean, I have the very disturbing diagnostic, which is that, given Iran's disposition toward the United States for some time, given its disposition toward Israel even prior to Ahmadinejad's ascent, to do what the Bush administration did, which is to eliminate Iran's only two enemies on the earth, the Taliban and Saddam Hussein. It's, I don't, and I think, yeah. So that's the starting point in that. And then compounded by the fact that in making the decision to go to war in Iraq, when Iraq was alleged to have a weapons of mass destruction program, North Korea had weapons of mass destruction. And, we know why the war in Iraq seemed preferable, because it's preferable to go to war with somebody who doesn't have weapons of mass destruction than to go to war with somebody who does. But no, I'm not even, but that then sends what signal to Iran? If you want not to get attacked, get yourself nuclear weapons. I mean, what conceivable signal would it send? And if you were, leave aside, again, the eliminationist anti-Semitism of Ahmadinejad and that regime, but if you were, if you wore what John Rawls calls the veil of ignorance, and you didn't know if you were an Iranian or an American or a Jew or a Muslim or what would you want for your country? You would want inoculation from a government that seems unpredictable right now. I mean, but the Bush administration seems really unpredictable and really, all to have John McCain saying bomb, 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 Iran. He's a presidential candidate. In any event, I'm just saying that I think we're fueling I think we strengthened Ahmadinejad. Clearly, he still, is very fragile within his country because he's not delivering economically. But I think, policies of engagement, I mean, I just talked to a group of Iranian students a couple weeks ago, and they just said absolutely the most devastating, so the policy that would most undermine Ahmadinejad would actually be to open up a consulate in Tehran. I'm not sure about that for security reasons, but I do think that to not talk to the government, I think you have to be able to walk and chew gum. You have to create a track where you, on the one hand, continually express your absolute determination to prevent the acquisition of weapons of mass destruction and work the diplomatic track with countries that have, like China, that and certainly like the European Union, that have leverage, and you need to be part of a community of leverage, because your leverage alone doesn't do it. But you need to stop incentivizing militarism and so forth. I mean, I really think you have to be engaging. The more we engage, the more we undermine the worst elements in those countries. Again, which doesn't mean pretending that he didn't say that the Holocaust didn't happen. It means always, we have this idea that if you do diplomacy, it means immediately you become Neville Chamberlain. That you forget the facts of what the government has done, or that you have to bracket it somehow. And there's a degree of that, of course, in any diplomatic negotiation. But I just think we are strengthening the very elements that are most dangerous in the neighborhood and in the region, and that one way to neutralize that is to start talking to Iran and to Syria. And whatever about options on the table, I mean, I hope it doesn't come to that, is all. I'd say Israel is probably more likely to strike perhaps than the United States, but it'll be interesting to see how, if it were to come to that, which country would strike first, because I don't think Israel is going to tolerate nuclear weapons in that country. That's my impression anyway. Yes, sir.
Thanks. I have a comment and a question. The comment is that I want to thank you actually for your article 2001 in The Atlantic, Bystanders to Genocide. I think, in my view, in my humble opinion, it's the best piece of journalism in the U.S. For the last 10 years. So thank you very much, and for everything you've done for educating Americans about genocide. The second part is a question, and I want you to talk a little bit, if you can, about the politics of recognizing past genocides. Barack Obama talking about the Armenian genocide obviously caused a stir. I'm wondering, A, if you played any role in that, and B, if talking about past genocides and thereby pissing off places like Turkey actually may, in fact, inhibit our ability to step into future genocides.
Yeah. On Barack, he was completely. It's amazing how hard one can work and how little influence one can have on somebody who's already exactly where you would want them to be on so many questions. I mean, he I think had already been out on the Armenian genocide as a state senator in Illinois, and with many issues that are dear to me, it's an open door. It's already, I'll excitedly say, here, we got to do this, and I'll be told by the staff, no, you did that a year and a half ago. Get over, come on. Tell us something we don't already know. So I didn't have any influence on it, but it's each case is very different, right, from the one before. I mean, people ask me a lot. I was talking to a professor here of the American West, and people ask a lot if our societal denial about Native Americans and the genocide or atrocities in the American West, if that is a factor in impeding our contemporary response, which maybe is a cousin of your question about denial and whether, I mean, I think denial is bad, allowing genocide is bad. I'm not sure if you had all of the memory in the world about your own culpability in doing something that translates into a willingness to do something about someone else's genocide. Now, I sort of contradicted myself a little bit because, I mean, the Clinton apology is interesting because Clinton's ability to articulate his own responsibility has had, as I've described, political traction. It has had a constructive effect on our ability to mobilize around his shame. But I don't know, if Clinton, let's forget Rwanda, if you had a president, if you had George Bush and there was no Iraq, but if Bush grappled with what had gone on in the American West, as a Texan, came out and talked about that and dealt with it and insisted it be in the textbooks, and I don't know what that buys Darfur as such. I just know that denial is wrong intrinsically. And the fact that, it obviously plays a role insofar as perpetrators who get away with something and get to write their history books encourage other perpetrators who believe they will get away with something and get to write their history books. And that's evidenced, of course, in Hitler's famous exchanges before invading Poland in 1935, 1936, where he said, now it looks like there's evidence he said it to 2 or 3 people on separate occasions, but after all, who remembers the Armenians? That idea that no one, whatever I do with the Jews, I can do it, it's inside my own neighborhood, no one's even gonna remember, I'm gonna win, and therefore no one else is gonna remember, and I'm gonna get away with it. So just like international justice, international memory is part of a milieu of deterrence, I think, conceivably, if you get it right. If people do remember, if people do get punished, even if not everyone gets punished, it just starts to, get in the brains of potential perpetrators. And what people forget, I certainly often forget about perpetrators of crimes of this nature, is that many of them are, people who haven't beaten their wives, who haven't stolen their neighbor's land, like they've lived decent lives, and every day, Alison DeForge writes about this in the Rwanda context, but when it comes to the foot soldiers of genocide, every day there are individuals who are deciding how far they're going to go. Whether they're going to pick up that machete and become a part of the genocidaire, or whether they're going to withstand those impulses. And of course, they're being threatened in some cases, and sometimes it's the herd. But with historical memory and with international justice, part of what you do is you try to get in the heads of those people, before they strike, before they tip. And so in that sense, I think, it's less about motivating the bystander as it is, actually signaling the perpetrator that you won't get away with it, that you won't get to, decide what gets remembered and commit the double crime against humanity, both the killing and then the crime of silence. I think it's incredibly important to overcome that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've got a couple of related questions. The first is about something you really didn't discuss.
So maybe just come up
Yeah,
with
I have a couple of related questions. The first is about something you didn't discuss, and the second about something that might have been understood in a way I don't think you would want it to be understood. The first is race, which didn't really play a role in your analysis. Do you think there is something to do with the fact that the genocides we seem to have not great concern about occur with people of color? Whereas in Kosovo, we had at least a marginal motivation to do something. I think if there were persecution of Jews again in Germany or of Armenians in Turkey, there would be a pretty widespread public uproar in this country. Why is it that with people of color, this doesn't seem to be happening, and it doesn't seem to mobilize constituencies, even constituencies of people of color? That's sort of bizarre, I think. Then the second thing in terms of species, I think it's totally implausible to believe that one can have a viable human rights policy without a concern for other animals as well. I think the two go together. Now, there have been trade-offs in history. The Nazis notoriously were concerned about animals. Himmler claimed that when they, he would outlaw hunting deer, for example.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be a kind of weird trade-off. On the other hand, I think also at the present time there's a very widespread and perhaps pervasive despair or pessimism about human beings. That the history of the human species has been a history of unmitigated destruction, of which recent genocides are simply a kind of culmination. And someone you could read who has been very influential recently, who seems to have this view, is Sebald, W.G. Sebald. And he seems to see things tending towards a return to nature, which will be good, because other animal species have not been, by any stretch of the imagination, as destructive as the human species. Now, that's something I think one really has to counteract with the argument that the relationship is complementary or supplementary, and you really cannot defend human rights or animal rights without defending the other.
Okay, well, I didn't mean to suggest...
Yeah, well, the Schroeder thing is a little ambiguous. That's
Schroeder, yeah.
Call me about
well,
the
no,
others.
I mean, it wasn't ambiguous. It was I mean, what she was saying is that they were kicking into overdrive to make sure that resources were sent into the Congo so that the guerrillas who were in danger in Rwanda, that there'd be shelter for them. And what I'm saying, and have no hesitation about reiterating, is that it's outrageous that we muster more quickly for endangered gorillas than for
Did that happen?
endangered human beings. Yeah,
There
absolutely.
was really protection of
No,
the
because there were
gorillas.
these. Yeah, absolutely. No, sorry. Yes, I should have followed the point. Now that doesn't. But by no means, was I trying to suggest that we should only mobilize for the people and let those, poor gorillas be slaughtered for meat, in the genocide, which is what the genocidaires set out to do as well, in order to fuel their genocide, because they were living in the bush with the guerrillas. So thank you for the opportunity to clarify. I mean, I wasn't saying that one is that we should be channeling all those resources, to something. But I mean, I think that structurally, in the mid-90s anyway, we were better. Groups were better and more sophisticated. Perhaps there's something about, and this actually will bring me to your first question. There's something about single issue groups and the sort of almost the very particularism of them that make those who subscribe to those causes, more relentless, and in a system where the squeaky wheel can get the grease, more effective. And being merely for human rights spreads you out across the universe. So the very universalism that makes a lot of people, again, quite sympathetic to human rights, wishing human beings well, perhaps doesn't imbue them with that, almost the zealotry that you need to actually make a difference in the moment, like to get out of your chair and do the deed and go and make the calls. And, it's very difficult to mobilize a response. So, which brings me to your first question about race, because I think that it's very much that's at work. Race, of course, is a factor, but to your point about if Jews and Armenians were killed today, there'd be the kind of response that there wasn't back in the day, and a different response than you'd get to an African genocide. I agree with you, but that is because I think exile emigre groups. Ethnic constituencies get created by genocide. I mean, why is there the Jewish population, the Armenian population in this country today? You wouldn't have those numbers if not for these two colossal genocides. And so the question is, who mobilizes for whom in real time when it matters? The Armenians were fortunate in 1915 in that Christian missionaries in this country mobilized on their behalf and saw a connection to them. The Jews were not so lucky in the 40s, where Jewish Americans felt more vulnerable. There were, of course, many heroic exceptions, but were much more, nervous about making the war seem to be a war fought on behalf of Jews. I mean, there was a self-censorship on the part of many Jewish leaders in this country. So when we come to race then in the 90s, race is a proxy to me. There's racism, there's organic racism for sure, but race is also a proxy for an absence of that kind of particularist domestic constituency. And you asked, why did people of color, not mobilize? You didn't mention Rwanda, but let's say, why did they not mobilize on behalf of Rwanda? Well, amazingly, they were mobilizing, the Congressional Black Caucus and Randall Robinson, Africa Action, these guys were all motivating about Haiti at that very time, because Aristide had just been overthrown, and you had all these Haitian boat people who were coming onto our shores. And frankly, African Americans in this country have had a hell of a lot more contact with Haiti and Haitians than they've ever had with Rwanda or Rwandans. I mean, we have no historic connection, colonial connection, anything to that country. And I think it asks a lot of African Americans. I mean, the very nature of the hyphenated thing, it's African Americans. It's a whole continent, and that's a kind of universality or potentially regional affiliation that doesn't necessarily correlate, again, into that sort of particularism that has people knowing who are Hutu, who are Tutsi. There was no one in America who knew who Hutu or Tutsi were. And to Kosovo and Bosnia, while I agree with you that we did respond and they were white and so forth, what really helped their cause, let me take Bosnia because Kosovo was really just an outgrowth of Bosnia, was the fact that it was in Europe and that the refugees were spilling over into very close allies of us. It was very expensive to care for those refugees. There was a fear of regional spillover into NATO countries like Greece and Turkey. So there was a nexus with security interests apart from the fact that they were white. And there was massive press coverage because geographically of where they were. I mean, it took 3.5 years to get an intervention in Bosnia, despite concentration camps, despite white people, despite the Olympics having been there. And I often did the thought experiment when I was living there, which was, would it make a difference if, in that instance, it was in the war itself, it was Serbs killing Muslims? Would the Western response be different if it had been Muslims killing Christians? And I didn't think that, at the time we weren't thinking about Islam in the way that we think about it today, but I was just thinking at least the Christians would have Christian churches in the United States that would mobilize. And the irony was Jewish groups mobilized on behalf of Muslims, I think actually far more ably and zealously than probably actually at that time Christians would have mobilized on behalf of Orthodox Serbs. So in the end, the intervention came about because of those natural constituencies. And so with race, I think you just see an absence of those natural, active, zealous, powerful constituencies. And that the rest of us, I always, people say, well, where was the Congressional Black Caucus? I say, well, where the hell was the Congressional White Caucus? We were a lot bigger, for Rwanda. But the point, certainly those affinities really help move people. What happens now? Are we done? No.
I'm nervous.
Oh, don't be.
Okay, one of the questions that I had is that as you've already said, the American age is drawing to something of a decline, and either a multicultural or a Chinese age is coming to a beginning. So the question I have, and this might be, this might not be the most politically correct question, is that if there is a multilateral culture, the culture that is not necessarily affiliated with the traditional value of West, traditional values of, say, Christianity, or the traditional values of tolerance, as imparted from the earlier foundation of West, and if you have these multilateral cultures, which does not necessarily view, tolerance, or would there be more, would there be even more of a delay, more of a problem of a genocide raging out of control, because so many of the current nations which are now coming to their own have had their sovereignties violated by the imperial West in the distant past, and I cannot but wonder if they will consider that the protection of sovereignty, the sovereign right, to be greater than the rights of the individual man.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's really well put. And I maybe have just rushed through it, but when I talked about the rise of China and just alluded to or touched upon sovereignty, I think that is the concern, is that, sovereignty has been, sovereignty isn't simply valued by countries for cynical reasons, to shield you from doing bad things within your own borders. That, in the human rights movement, that's how we have started to see it, because it's usually the abusers, it's the Robert Mugabes of the world, and the Chinese government or whatever, or Putin, sovereignty. So it always seems like it's a shield to just be left alone to be abusive in certain countries. I wouldn't say cultures, but in certain countries. And of course, very much correlating would be people like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, and the articulation of Asian values, which placed a premium on being left alone by Western countries and being free to develop, to put economic development ahead of civil and political rights and so forth. And so in the human rights movement, in the North America-based human rights movement, there's a tendency to see sovereignty as kind of the enemy of constructive engagement in societies where people are suffering. But the fact of the matter, as your question suggests, is for many people of good faith in the developing world, sovereignty is actually seen innocently, let's say, as a way of keeping imperial powers out of your business. And so what you have is the sort of the twin pillars, or the twin foundations of sovereignty in a country like China. One, we want to be left alone to do whatever the hell we want internally. We don't want to be told what to do by anybody. And two, we're actually genuinely hugely suspicious that you want to come in and impose your version of truth upon us. And even if you could somehow find an international consensus to chip away at the first foundation, it's really hard when that suspicion is that ingrained to imagine chipping away at the second. And so I mean, whatever about more genocides and so forth, I think what you're going to start to see is international institutions getting increasingly log-jammed by these distinct conceptions of individual. I mean, I say this. I mean, I've already gave the whole lecture about the U.S. government and how we don't, integrate in a natural way regard for human consequences and so forth. So to say that Asia somehow so far behind is sort of a little misleading. But there is at least an acceptance, an in-principle acceptance on the part of European governments that have already gone through the European Union process that giving up sovereignty is a good thing and that you get more out of it in the long term. There's an in-principle acceptance in the United States when it comes to other people's sovereignty. We don't want anybody meddling in ours. But other people's sovereignty, it's very fluid, and we like the fluid concept. But in Asia, I don't think there's any beginnings even of a relevant movement to chip away at the concept, and I think it really could have very harmful consequences. Yes, sir, I believe this is going to be the last one.
Last question.
Please.
I have a comment first that bears on your reference to Pat Schroeder and her suggestion about the difference between guerrillas and the difficulty of arguing about genocide, and it goes back to Dominic LeCapper's point about the relationship between animal and human rights. The UN Convention on Genocide came up before the United States Senate, I believe, 5 times before it was finally ratified. It was defeated 4 times with the opposition behind it of the American Bar Association and many other groups. And when it was finally passed, it was passed with such conditions and such riders as to, in effect, disable American commitment to the UN Convention. That took place over a period of something like 25 years. The Endangered Species Act passed on its first reading at the Senate and by virtually unanimous vote by consensus. The question I have goes back to what seems to me a tension in your comments between the very first point you made about national interest as somehow challenging efforts and defeating efforts to raise the issue of genocide or to raise the charge of genocide. And that seems, the tension that seems to me to be present there is that in your concluding comments, I mean, which gave some grounds for hope, you pointed to the internationalization of the institutions that were equipped and that had in fact been effective. I mean, the International Criminal Court is, in my view, an astounding accomplishment that it exists, that there are indeed prosecutions of criminals on an international basis, even with, as we know, the opposition of the United States towards those institutions. But then it seems to me that there's a moral to be drawn to that. It's true that you suggest that there's a grassroots movement within the United States. But as long as the nation state is the basic unit of organization, and as long as national interest is going to be the prime mover of the nation state, then it seems to me that the moral is obvious that there needs to be an international institutionalization, not only of punishing criminals, but of a warning system of something that's done at the time when the actions are actually being taken. I mean, so that this would call for, whether under the auspices of the UN or under some other international aegis of an institution that would in fact be able to sound the alarm on an international level, okay. And that a feature of that might well be a standing armed force that could be used to intervene. One of the problems, as we well know, is that for each occasion, it's a leading question, and I'm asking us. So Well, okay. The question is, what
I get it.
what institution would you recommend for this kind of early warning or
Okay.
this a tripwire that might serve the function prior to the commission, the committing
Okay.
of genocide?
Sorry, I need a drink. So I want to answer the question. Can I answer the question now? Can I answer the question? Yeah? Okay. No, sorry, I've been up for a long day. So let me answer the question. So as best I understand it, first of all, the tension that you describe between, on the one hand, reifying or describing the reification of national interests, as I have done, and believing that international institutions are indispensable in patrolling the commons and ultimately in having member states, nation states, chain themselves to the mast to fight off their lesser angels, so they're thank you, it'll just gonna say but that tension is real. That's the paradox on which, as you know, the international system has been built, that we know we can't trust states, which is why we have international treaties. We know we can't trust national laws and so forth. That was the lesson of Hitler, is that you could just legalize extermination. So you have to have higher laws, and yet what do we do in 1945? Of course, we rely on the very same states we know we can't trust to enforce those laws and to comprise those international institutions. But to think, you weren't suggesting this, but a lot of people, when they talk about UN reform or the kinds of institution building you're describing in the context of early warning or standing army, that can be done at an international level. It can. It has to be done unless we change our whole order, which would be welcome, but isn't going to happen anytime soon, given who has the power and who have the guns. It has to be done by convincing those building blocks, those nation states who comprise the UN, that it is in their national interest to give something up in the short term in order to get something back in the long term. And to think, people who believe in the UN and so forth have been talking about UN reform for as long as the UN has existed. And they will go every 5 or 10 years to the UN. Nothing will have been done internally or domestically to build a constituency for reform, because everybody thinks these issues can be handled by foreign policy professionals and by international lawyers. And so the states, which amount to sort of black billiard balls, end up coming together, unable to agree, because nothing has changed inside them. The priorities and the rankings and the valuation of international institutions has not changed in this country except to decline. The only reason the Genocide Convention passed was because it was in Ronald Reagan's domestic political interest to make it pass, because he had just gone to the Bitburg Cemetery in Germany and had offended Jewish groups and wanted something to offset it. The way that the UN will ultimately find a constituency in this country is when we do as we're doing now finally around global warming, and we understand that you can't deal with transnational threats unless you strengthen transnational institutions. You can't, just as a structural matter. Counterterrorism provides an opportunity to reintroduce Americans to international institutions, because we cannot get cells, in 111 countries on our own. And I think actually paradoxically, but the loss of faith in our competence creates an opening and a moment to potentially actually invigorate the conversation about, a different relationship to international institutions. And just in closing, the book I'm writing is on exactly this. It's a biography of Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was the best the UN ever produced, and he would have been the next Secretary General after Kofi Annan, but he was blown up in Iraq by the first ever suicide bomber in Iraq. And he was the sort of decathlete of nation building and a person who balanced liberty and security and did an incredible job seducing the United States and other sort of skeptics of the UN, trying to get resources from them and political commitments from them. But one of the reasons that I'm not just doing the book this time, but doing a feature documentary that'll be out in the movie theaters, and also a major Hollywood biopic about Sergio, is that I think we've never had a face for the UN and for international institutions. All we've had are UN scandals, Republican vitriol, Democratic cowardice on one side of the ledger, and then some warm fellow feeling by people like us who believe in the UN, but we haven't made it a politically relevant and a politically supported entity, in this society. And international law is the same thing, and that's why international law in a time of crisis proved as vulnerable as it did. The only constituency it had, and thank God they existed, were uniformed military. Ordinary Americans, didn't complain when these treaties were when we turned our backs upon them and when we denied people certain protections, and that has to change. And I'm hoping Sergio, because I think there has to be a human face, there has to be a story that penetrates politics if we're going to change our politics and our relationship to these higher bodies. I'm going to get into that. Thank you. Thanks.